Thank you for coming here. Kind of introduce yourselves if you'd like, and then typically the form is we go until you're finished.
Sure.
Which usually can go. We usually like to have a break at least by 7:30 and say, hey, if everyone needs to go, this is a good break time. If you have other content to go forward, then those good.
7:30.
Other than that, Wi-Fi here, food back there, bathrooms. Ask me, but they're just down that way and around. They're not too bad. Anyways, thank you for being here.
No problem.
Yep. So I'm going to stand up just so you can see my face. I'm Brendan. This is Trent. We work for Adobe, just over there. And yeah, so Trent was asked to come talk here because that's sort of what he specializes in, containers and Kubernetes. Ran out of air. I'm on the red team at Adobe, so we work for the digital marketing side. I think it's called Experience. It's the Experience Cloud business unit now. They keep changing names on us, making more clouds. But so we work for them. They don't do Photoshop, right? Trent will talk a little bit more about like what the business is that we do. But so I work on the infrastructure that hosts are the solutions that we make. So my job is to find all the holes, poke them, and then try and fix those, right? So people can't do it for reals. That's me. There's a place down in Lehigh that you can throw axes. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's like axe throwing.
Is it fun?
It's pretty sweet, yeah.
We went as a team, so it was really fun.
We had like 30 people there, competition. It was fun. I got a bullseye. It's not my only one. I made a few.
Everybody come back.
Oh, wait, nobody lost anything. They're pretty good. Apparently, if you play like in the league, they give you the real axes that are like proper full-size axes, but these are more like hatchets. But
Brendan cheated because he has the beard. That's like
it's like
+2 throwing.
Lumberjack +2, right? So.
But it's still fun.
Oh, you worked there for 3 years. Yep.
So yeah, I'm Trent Bennett. This is me in like a hacked together go-kart that my little brother made. So I would like to claim that I did that, but I'm not quite that awesome, but it's pretty cool. You know, he's got the little like reindeer on the top.
Kind of hard to see, but it's like one of those wireframe reindeers that people put out, right?
I was trying to figure out what that was.
There's a bottle of NOS energy drink on the top, you know, just to like speed up the car. So,
Where was that?
in Wyoming, where I live. So yeah.
You trust your brother.
Yeah, no.
To a point.
He's a pretty smart dude when it comes to that stuff. I couldn't do that. So, but yeah, like Brendan said, we started working there around the same time, about 3 years. So I focus on container security across the digital experience business. We collaborate with digital media a little bit. So that's kind of been my focus since I started. The second week I got to Adobe, my manager shipped me off to MezosCon. And I didn't even know what a Mesos was. You know, I was like, what is this thing that I'm being thrown into? And now, you know,
He's the go-to. If there's a container on anything, they just ship it to him.
Yeah, so it's been a growing experience, but it's been fantastic. And I love Kubernetes. So as security guys, we generally like Kubernetes. So yeah, anyways. So Adobe, we just wanted to thank Adobe for allowing us to present today and giving us jobs so that we can, you know, get to play with Kubernetes and in Brandon's case, hack things. You know, sort of jealous of that sometimes. We work for digital experience, as you mentioned, and digital experience, that side of the business focuses on helping businesses deliver personalized content that customers can enjoy, and really just trying to help businesses deliver their product in a personalized way. I guess I can say that. So moving on.
Just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to just butt in.
Yeah. Any questions about us? Kind of wanted to get to know you guys a little bit first, though. So is there anyone here that is not quite using Kubernetes yet, but might want to? Or anyone that's not super, like, just getting started? Yeah, okay, cool. Cool. How about for those of you who are using Kubernetes, are you using, which of these platforms are you using, if we can have a raise of hands? AKS? Okay. EKS, Amazon? Okay. All right, you guys are mostly self-hosted then?
There's
Is that like every other hand in the room is-
DigitalOcean just released their.
Okay, yeah, I didn't. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. I guess that's self-managed in a way. Right? Yeah, DigitalOcean just released
DigitalOcean.
GA Prod today. If you want to go,
Have
host
a-
in a droplet or something like that.
Then do you guys do like one tenant in the cluster, or do you have multiple tenants per cluster?
One tenant.
Multiple. Okay, so sort of varied.
But when you're asking them, what you're asking as far as environments go, or the actual tenants themselves being anybody?
We were thinking more like the tenants ourselves. So the way we do it, we'll talk more about it, but we break up namespaces in the tenant, and then we give like a tenant a namespace. So it can be services or users.
Or I guess if you have multiple customers, maybe you can consider that multi-tenant as well, right? Where it's like, you wouldn't want the same two different shopping stores that might be competitors, kind of a thing in the same cluster, right? Or you would be okay with having those in the same cluster as long as you thought that through, right? Kind of multi-tenant. Do you guys have dedicated security teams, or you kind of do it on your own?
Does a team of 2 count?
Yes, that's a team.
Yeah.
Team of more than one.
Team of me. Okay. Cool. All right.
You might notice this is our first time here, so we don't really know
All of you.
businesses that are here. We'll try and get better.
Reddit only has 2 security engineers.
That are officially labeled as security engineers, yes. There's many more on Intra, but the people that we would say it's their job.
Fair enough. I mean, hopefully that could be okay if you have like security people embedded in the team.
Well, and especially on the container side. So they had a legacy team, and they're starting to learn the container side, but there's 2 people that are like officially designated as Kubernetes security.
The blessed.
Okay, cool. So specifically today, we're talking about a multi-tenant implementation at Adobe. There are other teams that are doing like AKS, EKS, whatever, right? But this is one of our teams that's very large and hosts more like hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 or more production applications, and they're working to launch their Kubernetes offering right now, and they've done a pretty good job from the security standpoint, and we've worked with them on that. So first, we're going to briefly start off by talking about a list of best practices. But I know you guys didn't come here to listen to a list, because there's plenty of blogs that are like, here's 100 things in Kubernetes that you should do, or maybe not 100, right? But that's not very exciting. But basically, we're just going to go through that like high-level best practices. We'll dive in deeper where it makes sense, where
Or if you guys have questions.
and then we can kind of and then we can get into the meat of the material. So again, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt us.
Or if you disagree, we'll have a friendly disagreement.
Okay, so starting off. So best practices, first for the API server, audit logging. So audit logging is extremely awesome in Kubernetes. You can log who did what against the API server at what time. It's extremely powerful compared to some container solutions that don't have a whole lot of logging.
That shall not be mentioned.
But that said, the API server doesn't log everything, just to highlight that. So if you are on a node and you're doing something manually there, obviously the API server isn't going to be aware of that. Also, if you kubectl exec into a pod, the API server is not aware of what you're doing in that exec session. So from a security point of view, if my team could, we would love to see, what's going on inside that exec. If an attacker has an exec session, it would be fantastic to see what's going on. But the API server logs themselves don't have that. That said, these are still super helpful. You can see, what resources are we talking about? Is someone grabbing secrets that they shouldn't have access to? And really, if you had a cluster compromise, this would be the place that you would want to go. You'd want to be able to have a forensic picture where you could look over time and say what happened here based on the user that could have been compromised or so on. There's a good talk that I have it in the resources section at the end of the deck. It's a talk by an engineer from Heptio that she does a pretty good job of going through how you might make audit logs potable, is the way that she put it.
Who do you give access to Adobe to go right into Kubernetes through the API? Like,
How do you get access to it?
Who are you giving access to? All engineers, can they hit it? Or?
Right.
So we're doing a few different things. For Kubernetes right now, they have few different levels of access. So it's like we just give them credentials to their namespace and let them do freely what they need. There's also another, like, I don't think it's implemented yet in Kubernetes, but we have like a pipeline to like put code in if you don't want to like self-manage your Kubernetes stuff.
Then you never touch a namespace. It's just you deploy an app, right? It's the idea being that as a developer, we don't always feel that. I mean, some developers do want the level of access where like give me a namespace, right? But in some cases, it doesn't really make sense where a developer doesn't really care that it's Kubernetes and they shouldn't have to, right? The other thing is that if they do want a namespace, the team that we're talking about is working on an onboarding API where they log into this, either a UI or API, and they provide some set of details that we require of them, and some of those are related to security, and then we provision a namespace for them. And they can choose, you know, this group has access to be admin in the cluster, this group has access, or not in the cluster, rather in their namespace, or view in the namespace, edit in the namespace. And we kind of talk a little bit about that, but that's kind of the concept, is that we can tie Active Directory groups to namespaces and permissions inside that namespace. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Right, cool.
Yep.
Sure.
Maybe you said it, but I didn't catch whether you guys were doing this on EKS or what.
So let's just repeat. She was asking where we put, or where we're hosting it, right?
Yeah, so it's hosted on multiple cloud providers. Right now it's not on EKS, but that doesn't mean that down the road we wouldn't use EKS. But yeah, it's multi-cloud right now.
So you're using Google?
Not right now. Google, we have some footprint in Google, but not, yeah, we're not using GKE right now. Other questions? Okay. Next consideration, use encryption in etcd. So for those of you that might be new to Kubernetes, etcd is kind of this place where state for the entire cluster is stored, as well as, you know, secrets, for example, is a type of state, right? But secrets in etcd are the thing that I think we're most worried about here. So you want to encrypt etcd as a result. Minimize network exposure. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but yeah.
Right. So I just want to make sure on the encryption you're talking about storage as well as the encryption where we have the symmetric key that's on that master. So talk about that, where the actual data is actually encrypted as well as you're encrypting the volumes, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it's encrypted, like in transit as well as at rest. I don't know if there's a strong opinion on, you know, it has to be encrypted on the way end. Yeah, I don't know. Anyways. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about minimize network exposure in a minute. Disable anonymous access. So this one is relevant because of there was a vulnerability in December of this last year where if you were authorized, and in this case you were anonymous, so you were authorized to make some connection to the API server, you could basically exploit this vulnerability that would give you more access into the cluster. So you go from being anonymous to having a foothold actually in the cluster itself. So this is actually disabled out of the box in 1.14, which is pretty new. But if you don't need this, there's no reason to not turn it off, right? It's just a good idea. And then finally, TLS everywhere, and we have a bit more on this and why this is important here in a minute.
Story later.
Yeah, story later. Application.
Even inside the cluster.
Yeah.
Inside the cluster. Yeah, and
That's where the story comes in.
Yeah. It might. Maybe we're overhyping it. Maybe it won't be that exciting. You never know. All right, those animated backwards. So first, from an application point of view, don't put secrets in config maps. That's not what they're intended for, right? Usually the permissions around config maps are a little lighter than around secrets. Also, don't run as root and container. This one is really actually pretty tricky. The reason why, as many of you may know, is that pretty much every image in your standard Docker Hub, Quay, whatever, are all built assuming you're just going to use root, right? And we'll talk for a second in a minute here why this could be problematic. Other capabilities to limit root. There's a concept called a seccomp profile in Docker. What that is it whitelists what syscalls are allowed from the container. And Docker has a pretty sane set of defaults there. And so if you can stick to those defaults, that's generally a pretty good idea. Same thing with Docker capabilities. Those are Linux capabilities that the process adds. So for example, there's a cap sysadmin that allows you to capture network traffic. That's an example of a privileged capability that allows you to capture network traffic, and so you'd be able to sniff secrets. Hopefully you're encrypting those in transit, so that wouldn't be as big of a deal, right? But that is an example of a privileged capability that you probably don't need in your container. And then finally, the third point there, SE Linux or AppArmor. These are access control limits that make it so that if someone is trying to break out of your container, there's more of a limit around them. I should also mention that these mostly apply to actual applications tenant facing. There are obviously going to be instances where your logging driver needs higher privileges, or there are going to be plenty of other examples where you do need privileges, and those are legitimate, but you want to be judicious about how you're applying that. Docker user namespace remapping. Any of you guys familiar with this in Kubernetes upstream?
No, I made it upstream, but in Docker.
Okay. So the painful part of it right now is it is in Docker, but it's not in Kubernetes. So this has been open, I think, since 2016, maybe earlier. There's an open issue. Basically, I guess I should define what user namespace remapping is. So what it does is it makes it so that user UID 0 in the container is a high number UID on the host. So that makes it so that root in the container is really not root on the host, but now you don't have to rebuild your images to use a different user. So it's really just pretty convenient. But Kubernetes upstream doesn't yet support it, and that's the issue that's been open for so long. And it's kind of been kicked around for a little bit, and I think it's just been tricky for them to implement, since Kubernetes tries to be sort of containerizer agnostic. They don't want to build too tightly towards Docker, and then the next thing like Kata containers or whatever comes along next. They don't want to be directly tied, to the Docker constructs. So this isn't supported, which is unfortunate. And the reason why for that is because of the run C vulnerability that was recently announced in, what was that, like 1 or 2 months ago? The run C vulnerability, what it was is that the run C process that launches the container could be overwritten by a malicious container, meaning that whoever did that and whoever owned that container, whether via compromise or whatnot, would be able to overwrite that and have root execution on the host. And so the requirements for that were that you had to be running your container as root. And so this user namespace remapping would actually prevent you from being exploited by that, as well as don't run root in the container. So kind of the approach here is try to be multi-layered where you can be, right? Some of these are more tricky. It actually turned out, I was reading the vulnerability report on the security list website, the Nmap one, can't remember off the top of my head.
Seclist?
Seclist, thank you. The SE Linux on Debian actually did not block the run C vulnerability, which kind of surprised me. Yeah, the default profile. So I imagine they probably changed that by now, but I was surprised that even SE Linux didn't drop it. So it was kind of either you ran as root or you didn't run as root and you were safe, or maybe you had the vulnerability there. We'll also mention that if you run on CoreOS, CoreOS has a read-only user bin. So if you had your run C there, by virtue of having the read-only partition, you were actually safe. So that was kind of a nice feature of CoreOS.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the cluster itself. So again, kind of listy. We're going to try and not do listing, but network policies. Is anybody using network policies right now? So network policies make it so you can communicate or like set rules for communication within your cluster. So it's sort of like a firewall between things, right? So it makes it like you can set rules, and we'll talk about some of the rules that we use a little bit later to like allow communication between namespaces or between services, or if you need to talk to the system namespace in Kubernetes, you can set that up as a rule. We also want to node authorization. I think there's 3 modes of authorization in Kubernetes. I don't remember all of them, But the node authorization, it's not default.
No, yeah, you have to enable
It's
it.
not default, but what it does is it makes it so the nodes, when they reach out to the API server to get information about what's, I don't know, any jobs running, they can only query stuff that's running on that node. So you can't find information about jobs running on different nodes or like the pods, the containers, anything running on a different node. So you sort of limits the scope. If someone were to somehow get execution on your node, it couldn't get out of that node that way. So that's kind of cool. Then principle of least privilege, right? So just give it what it needs. It can be tedious with containers because you have to figure out exactly what it needs. And when it comes to Linux capabilities, I'm not an expert, and I don't know too many people who are. But there's like 39 capabilities that you can give or take away. So if you can figure out exactly what it needs and only give it that, you're going to be a lot safer.
Often the defaults are pretty sane. They try to handle cases like, if you have a web server container, they give you most of the capabilities that you would need in a standard Docker container.
But if you're building your own, that could be difficult.
So are you going to be talking about like which CNI you're using for your network policy?
Yeah.
Okay, pod security policies. We use those. We use them. Well, I think we have two. We have like a restricted and a non-restricted policy.
Define what the security policy.
Yeah. So the pod security policy are like rules around what pods can do. So you can specify like this. You cannot put in a pod or a deployment that has privileged containers. You can't. If it's running root inside the container, then you won't let the deployment go through. You can require that they drop specific capabilities as well. So you can fine grain and control exactly what you want in your cluster, and you apply them based on labels using Kubernetes labeling system. So we have a restricted and non-restricted. We have a non-restricted for admin pods that need capabilities to admin the cluster or to make sure that the node's working right or whatever you're doing with it. And then we have a restricted one that doesn't allow privileged containers. So we actually have an example. This is a pod declaration. It's pretty simple. It's like using Apache on 80, and I said that, okay, we're going to make this a privileged pod. So I try and run it, and Kubernetes API says, sorry, there's not a pod security policy here that this matches, privileged containers aren't allowed, so it just blocks the whole deployment. So Gandalf is doing his thing. But this is where the story comes in that we mentioned earlier. There is this. So I did a review of the way that we've set up this implementation of Kubernetes. What I found was if I tried to declare a pod specifically that was privileged, it would block it. But if I used the deployment, so you can, is everyone clear about what the difference between a deployment and a pod declaration is? So if you use a deployment the way that we were doing it, it would just bypass all pod security policies. And that came to here. So if you look at pod security policies on the API docs, which are really, their API docs are really well done. But there's this troubleshooting step here. It says the controller manager must be run against the secured API port and must not have super user permissions. Otherwise, requests would bypass authentication and authorization modules. All pod security policy objects would be allowed, and users would be able to create privileged containers. So that's what we were doing at the time. I found that you could just deploy a privileged container, and it didn't make any sense at the time. But we went to the guys implementing it, and they read this, and they're like, "Oh well, we're doing that, right?" So we had our controller manager going against the insecure API port. So on the master, there's an insecure and a secure port to talk to the API. And the insecure port, it just accepts everything. It really doesn't care who's submitting a job or what it's doing or which controller is talking to it, because it doesn't take context or authorization.
It was only listening on localhost, but even then, we weren't by deploying a deployment, or rather creating a deployment. The controller manager is actually managing that. So the controller manager didn't pass any context of the user submitting it. It's like, okay, well, privileged pod, that's great, allow, right? So that was kind of the vulnerability.
So we found that, fixed that, and now we can't do that. But Yeah.
In addition to switching, do you disable?
Yeah, definitely do that. There's a flag on your API server called -- insecure port, and if it's 0, that means that it's okay, or is it a 1?
I think so. I think it's
0 means like, yeah, this insecure port is there.
Are you going to talk about the versions of Kubernetes? Some of these capabilities with inside, you're talking at a particular version.
Right.
And above. So
we went back and we looked at the flags for the current version, and it's no longer documented. It's not there anymore, the insecure port, but it's probably there for backwards compatibility. Like it has to recognize it. Whether they like completely nerf that functionality or not, maybe they just see, okay, here's a flag, but then throw it away. We're not really entirely sure.
As
But
you
it's,
know more about that, Paul.
sometimes they won't load with
Right.
that. Yeah.
so I have a.
Backward compatible. Depends on how many versions back.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about are you talking 114, 113?
So I'm on 113.
It was, I think it was 112 at the time when we did it. Yeah.
But I checked the cluster that I'm running at 113 right now, and the flag is there. It's like in the command arguments, right? But so they took it out of we went back and we checked all the way to 110, and it's completely gone. It's like not in the documentation
I don't know
anymore.
at what point they removed it.
But if you go look up like some blogs or the CIS benchmarks for Kubernetes, the Center for Internet Security, they talk about it and they say, please don't do this, right? Like, so it existed even if it's not there now.
Any questions? I think we're going a little fast right now. Any questions about anything at all?
Trying to figure out, like, I know you guys know Kubernetes, but I don't want to bore you to death if we're like talking basics and everyone knows what we're doing. So trying to find a balance.
Or if you don't know basics, that's fine too.
Yeah, that's great. Raise your hand, ask questions.
Are you going to talk more about your audit logging at all?
We don't have anything about audit logging.
But we can talk about it more.
I just wanted to understand, what are you using for the storage, and two, what's your retention policies and all this stuff?
Yeah, so I don't know that we have a retention policy defined. So we use Splunk, and so the retention policy is on the index rather than the any sort of storage. And
for those of us that cannot drive a BMW to all the time,
What?
Porsche.
But you all don't have Teslas?
So we just put it directly in S3, and every month we rotate to Glacier.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we never look at it.
Right.
We just
So you still have it, right? Cold storage.
If we ever need to look at it, but for now it's like we have it.
Do you do anything like digesting it so you know that nobody's,
Well, it's-
Tampered
right now
in?
we don't. We just store it, and then if we ever need to look at it later, at least we have it.
We should.
But, so if you
Yes,
have the index
we're doing
and
that.
it's searchable, that's where the money comes in, right? When you pay for Splunk to make it searchable.
Yeah.
So we figured, if we're gonna have to look through these logs, it's gonna be painful. So.
Did you time lock it so we can't just wipe out the bucket?
So I don't know if Splunk does the non-tampering.
So, well, once you've shipped it off the cluster, we're kind of
Yeah.
If you could tamper with our Splunk, there's a whole lot.
A whole lot of other problems.
Yeah, we ship it off the cluster pretty instantaneously, so we're not overly worried about that. There's a logging driver that we have that I think it's based off of Fluent that ships logs from the cluster to Splunk right away. But yeah, I'm not sure what the retention policy is on that index. We keep things for a decent amount of time.
A long time.
So, other questions? That was a good question.
The TLS everywhere.
Yeah, I guess I didn't cover that. So it was the fact that like we weren't using TLS and no certificates talking to the insecure port. So if we were requiring TLS everywhere, we would have had to use a secure port. Does that make sense? So you have to have like your content in
Is
your
your question
authorization.
beyond that?
Did I jump in?
I assume you were talking about actually doing applications, but so.
You should do that too. But
Yeah,
Mostly
I
the
guess
cluster.
on that slide we were trying to call out specifically the API server, right?
So etcd through masters, nodes to API server.
And then all the internal master components
And
itself.
all the determinants.
Right.
And then you're going to say on top of that.
I mean, it would be great to have SSL between containers. I don't know if that's always realistic for everyone.
Well, you use it for your cert management.
Right.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Fortunately, unfortunately.
Themselves to a certain extent.
Yeah, so that's actually, I know somebody said Istio. Yeah,
Roll code.
yeah, Istio will do like native MTLS, right?
We were going to talk about HDO, but then we heard that it's like political, so we didn't.
I don't know about political. It's more like, I don't know. It's like Jacob versus Edward kind of a thing, right? Like,
That was a Twilight reference, guys. That was Twilight. That's Twilight.
I was trying to mock that.
That was gross.
I'm so sorry.
The sad part is that I get the reference.
So yeah, like there are tools like Istio that do MTLS. Istio is really big though, right? It has a lot of features. Not that that's bad, but it also doesn't support filtering outside of, I think it's like TCP.
It doesn't do UDP filtering.
I think it does gRPC maybe, but it doesn't do UDP. Yeah, so if you're planning on using it as a security tool, like an attacker might use UDP, right? Or like if you ask one of our former red team guys, like, would you ever tunnel TCP over UDP? It's like, oh, no, I'd never do that.
Definitely not. Wouldn't do that. It's the worst.
Yeah. So anyways, so getting to our CNI, well, I guess we'll get to that in a little bit, but I'll just talk about it right now. So we use Cilium, which I think I saw a video that they came and talked to you guys, right? They actually have native support for TLS as well between nodes. So the difference between Istio's TLS is it's between every instance of the container or the pod rather, and every other pod that it might connect to. With Cilium, it's actually node to node. So the number of connections that you're talking about managing that TLS session for is a lot lower.
Do you think that's good enough?
Is it good enough?
Yeah. So you're saying if you're on the same node, two pods can talk to each other without TLS on the same node?
I think they still do TLS.
Oh.
You'd probably have to ask the
TLS
Cilium
on
guys.
local host 'cause it's the exact same thing.
So there's
But
no
container pod to pod, you know what I'm saying?
So
But
the
I mean,
roadmap in the future is to use the MTLS and kernel, actually in the kernel doing TLS, so that you can actually move between node to node and also pod to pod.
Right. Yeah, it's been a little bit. But yeah, they have a ton of features around that. And I think for the reason that it's node to node and not, a mesh of all the pods talking to each other, it might be a little more performant. That said, I don't know much about Istio compared to what I should maybe, so.
Yeah, we have some people who do the evaluations for the technology, and it's not us. But they do a really good job. At least I think they do a good job.
Only job?
No, it's not their only job.
He
He is the architect. He's like the architect of the program sort of thing. So he like evaluates all the potential technologies. He's got like spreadsheets and lists with check marks and X's, and it seems pretty comprehensive. I haven't double checked his work, but.
Any other questions?
Has he looked at Istio?
He did, yeah. He compared it to Cilium, and we went with Cilium. I'm not saying that's what everyone should do. It's just the way that we're doing it.
It didn't fit our use cases, I think, what I came
And they're
down
not
to.
mutually exclusive.
No, they're not.
No.
They have a lot of overlap. Like you could use both. Right.
It gets a little nuanced because you have to.
Right.
Anyways, I'm not the guy to talk about Istio because you had to like run Istio as privileged. I don't know. It was quite a bit of work. So. All right. So moving on to RBAC, I think we had a couple questions around this already, but I think this.
Yeah. So we talked briefly about this. The way that we implement RBAC is through Active Directory. So we have some in Azure and AWS and like our data centers, and we use Active Directory for all of those. And then we have LDAP, like Active Directory on LDAP, and we assign LDAP roles and whatnot. And then that makes it so that you can like assign you can give people cluster access or namespace access based on the roles that you give them. So we mentioned earlier we use multi-tenant. Like we have a bunch of tenants in the same clusters, and we just use the namespaces to segment them. And then who's familiar with custom resource? Crap, I always forget. Custom resource definitions, yeah. It's basically a way to like create Kubernetes resources that don't come with Kubernetes.
like extend the API basically. Right?
Yeah, and you can create. They're really flexible. You can create what you need. If you have a product that doesn't fit nicely into their definition, you can do your own. But something that we use to help like with those and doing like the cluster roles and whatnot inside is anyone familiar with aggregated cluster roles? It's actually a new concept to me too. So what you do, let's see, can you guys see that in the back? How about now?
Oh man, I messed up.
Waiting for Trent to fix it.
Closer.
That down. Yep. How about that? Well, just looking at the code section, can you make it a little bit bigger? Oh man, it does. There you go. Okay. So it's just a cluster role definition, but there's no rules, right? And then if you scroll down to the next example, oh, hold on. More important thing. So Kubernetes uses labels for everything, right? Not everything, but that's how you like you select stuff, right? It uses those as its selectors. So if you have this empty rules, but then you create another one, oh man, I got ahead of myself again. Sorry, labels. We're back on labels. There's a label in the cluster role definition there, right? So aggregate to monitoring true. So then if you create other definitions for cluster roles, and they have the same label, right? The one that's empty will just like aggregate all of them. It just like gobbles them up and makes one big rule for that cluster role, which is kind of neat because then you can do it dynamically and decide like what you want in there and label things different ways, and they sort of all do it themselves. And so that's pretty neat the way that you can like fine grain the control over that. So we use a lot of it. We use that.
Does that concept make sense to everybody?
It's just like using labels to select cluster roles, right?
And then it automatically aggregates it for you.
Yeah.
They do it out of the box for the edit, view, and admin roles. And then you can, like if you wanted to manage those or add to those roles, let's say that you, for example, Cilium has Cilium network policies, which is a custom resource definition. So if you want to use the Cilium network policy as part of the Kubernetes API, you would want to add that custom resource definition to one of those aggregation rules.
This is like some of them. Here's the admin, the edit, and the view rule, right? So you can do more than one label on the rules too. That was new to me. Like you don't just do one label, you can do more than one. So like admin and edit get the same permissions in this case.
Yeah. So in this example, they're saying allow git, list, watch, create, update, patch, to this custom resource cron tabs, and then now automatically edit and admin can edit and I guess do all of these via verbs right here, right?
We're probably not recording this because we're sharing the app.
Let's.
Okay, we're on the API.
Yeah, we're on the
docs.
So
aggregate cluster roles.
you're with the meta controller.
The meta controller? Not familiar.
No, I'm not familiar.
It allows you to do CRDs with simple scripts and such. So I was just wondering if that would.
Yeah, they may be doing.
That
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure. Yeah, we haven't used those at all, at least from security.
Any questions around RBAC or cluster roles?
Okay. So network policy. As we said, we use Cilium. It has some pretty cool features. So one of them, and maybe you guys have already heard this, so you can tell me to move on. So let's say, for example, S3. If you ask S3 for an IP address, it'll give you a new one pretty much every time. So if you wanted to write firewall rule policy that said only allow to S3, then you would have to basically open to the entire internet, except for Cilium allows you to specify a domain name that you would like to allow to, and you can also wildcard that domain name. It actually uses a DNS proxy in line, so it catches the response to your DNS query as you're doing it. So it's pretty handy. It really makes it a lot easier to do this. Like from a security point of view, we love the idea of deny by default. You should only access the things that you know you need access to. And this makes this way easier, right? Back in the day, it was like, give me an IP address and a port, and if that ever changes, then you have to go talk to network engineering, and it'll be like a 5-day process to get that rule through, right? Where this is like, give us a domain name and we're golden, right? So that's super convenient. You can also use the standard Kubernetes network policy, which is just select a label of another pod and namespace, or either or, and apply policy based on that. Any questions about either of those?
So do you guys use both?
We do, yeah.
So we use both. I don't know if the mic's picking it up. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
restate the question. Do we use both of these? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Do you use it primarily for egress, or also does it allow for like ingress pod to pod style thing?
I haven't tested it for pod to pod, but it should. I think it should. I mean, you would just be pointing to like the service DNS name, right? And I think Cilium would be able to catch your request to the DNS server anyways, so it should just be handled the same way.
On the network policies, how do you know if your applications or the network policies are poorly written, or applications are just throwing away traffic, or if somebody's hacked in and somebody trying to violate the network policies? How do you audit that?
Right. So we keep track of. We actually query the API server and kind of try to understand what the network policies look like, as well as other resources inside of Kubernetes, and then we can audit it based off of that. Cilium, yeah, you could do other things to. Well, yeah, I don't know if I can
Cilium logs quite a bit.
It does. It does. But yeah, that's the main thing. You can also talk to the Cilium guys. They may have more that you can do there.
They're pretty easygoing.
Yeah. That is tricky, right? Because if you have this deny by default policy and then you hand it to some developers and they, all of a sudden their app is dropping packets, that's not a good place to be in, right? That's not a very good user experience. So we actually have also created like a base set of policies to try to, because no one likes writing YAML, right? Like, even though we're all in Kubernetes, I don't think any of us is like, I love writing me some YAML, give me YAML all day long, right? So not fun. So we actually wrote like a base set of like, this is an example policy, and then developers should just be able to copy paste and kind of sub out things. It's not great, honestly, still. I mean, the experience can be better. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Kind of.
Hints at it. Can I ask a follow-up one? So,
Sure.
You said a sample network policy. So are you writing a network policy like per application, or do you have, the way I did it is I wrote a network policy and then I added a label that applied that network policy.
Right. So we have a set of base policies that I was about to talk about.
Yeah.
But so it's a set of base policies that kind of define like this is the minimum bar, and then you build on top of that per. In our case, we typically have a service per namespace, and so we apply the policy at the namespace level. So a few things that we've done to try to make it easier. So the Ingress controller is kind of the software load balancer of the Kubernetes cluster, right? We pretty explicitly rely on that for exposing things outside the cluster. We don't generally have tenants creating load balancers directly. They just use the Ingress controller. So we have a convenience rule that says if you've created an Ingress rule, we'll automatically allow you to talk, or the Ingress controller to talk to you. Meaning that, until that Ingress rule is created, really there's no traffic going on. It's just, it makes it much easier. So anytime you want to expose an app, you don't have to write another network policy. That's kind of a convenience one we've tried to add. Other ones we allow outbound to the cluster, but in the network policies, you have to specify both the egress and the ingress rule. And so the egress is allowed, but the other side of the connection has to decide who it wants to allow from. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered your question still or not, but okay. Any other questions?
You said one service per namespace.
Typically, I guess when I say service, it's not like, when I say service, it's like a microservice with related things. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. I feel like the word service gets
An Adobe service, not a Kubernetes service.
Right. Yeah. That's a good distinction. It's for the recording. That's an Adobe service, not a Kubernetes service. Yeah, that would get painful, I think, right? Yeah. Cool. Other questions? All right. We also deny outbound to the internet by default, and then people should hopefully know. I forgot to mention these rules are stateful. So if you allow in, you automatically allow the return traffic. So that's pretty handy. In most cases, I wouldn't anticipate that most applications are going to need outbound access that's unpredictable. So that's kind of the goal there, is that we should be able to deny outbound to the cluster, to the internet by default. And really from a security point of view, like I don't know how many of you guys have dedicated security teams. I think there was a small handful. But as a security guy, we love that, right? If your network policy is allow 80 and 443 to the internet, you basically just defeated the entire point of having the egress policy, right? Because all of the script kiddies that are going to do things will be able to go out on those ports just fine, right? Your standard crypto miners, they can probably just change the port if they need to, right? So being able to restrict it to only the known set of services that they need is really handy. It kind of blocks the exfiltration path a little bit more. All right, Ingress. So we use Contour managing Envoy. We have one for public and one for access to Adobe networks. And so the way that works is that, if you're developing, you're just kind of coding up a test application, we automatically just assume, if you don't give us an Ingress class, which tells you which one of these you're going to choose, we'll just drop you to the Adobe network so that you're not accidentally exposing something preliminary to actually wanting to release it to the internet. And again, this is the only way that we anticipate people expose an app to the world. It kind of reduces costs as well, because we only really have those that deployment of Envoy proxies instead of every tenant spinning up a separate load balancer. Questions on that?
So are you, when you do pod, or excuse me, when you do service TLS, right, script, are you doing Contour? Is that where your certs are? Are you?
Yeah, so the certs are typically at the Contour level, okay. and then you can also do the node-to-node installing that we were talking about.
And are those let's encrypt?
Let's encrypt certs, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So are they rotating?
Yeah. So yeah, they're definitely not let's encrypt. I don't think many of Adobe would be happy.
How are you handling rotation?
Yeah. So the tenants themselves own some of the certificates, and then I think there's actually sort of like a managed service type of model where the administrators of the cluster will manage the rotation themselves. So I guess that doesn't really help you guys, but I'm not quite sure 100% how they're rotating. Do you know, Blaine?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit manual. I'll say it that way, just because I've got a CIO that she really hates certificates expiring, and we've had some issues.
We've never had an outage because of that.
No,
never had.
Who has not had an outage because of?
Are you saying this month or?
So we've got some projects to kind of help that out.
Right.
It's a set of scripts that usually, and then some of our clients that are in financial area, they have to manage their own certs, so they will essentially delegate that to us, but usually there's a little bit of back and forth there.
You use like cert manager, vault, all that junk. I mean, gone down that road. Done it once.
There's some.
We use Vault.
We use Vault, but I haven't heard about the cert management.
You were
Does rotation for you.
Yeah, that's nice.
You were mentioning using Kubernetes for secrets. Do you use the built-in etcd backs ones, or do you use Vault them?
Yes.
and where's the delineating line?
Either or. There isn't necessarily a policy that says you have to use one or the other. Yeah. Okay. So I think hopefully this next chunk is the most exciting or most interesting part, because this is where you can do bad things and hurt yourself. So here be dragons.
Here be dragons. Basically, it's like we're going to kind of briefly talk about ways you can shoot yourself in the foot when it comes to doing things with Kubernetes. So the first is, if you're on a cloud provider, don't assume that they're going to do everything for you. So AKS and EKS, you sort of own your own worker nodes. Like so AKS is more managed-ish
I don't know if you're familiar with the managed dish concept, but
it's like
AKS is pretty much fish.
our understanding, and maybe you probably know better, so you can correct us if we're wrong. Is that like they sort of get the patches ready, but you have to reboot your own nodes for it to apply. So like they do half the work, but then you have to manually do part of it as well.
You also can't customize the image, but you're still responsible for the security of that node.
And they don't want you to install anything on the node because it might not be supported, and then it might break something. But so they're more managed-ish.
Comes with benefits, maybe some downsides.
And then have any of you used Helm? Yeah, right. So package manager for Kubernetes.
Extremely popular, right?
Really popular. There were a few issues up and coming Helm. So Helm uses Tiller. Okay. So let me try and clarify. The current version that they released recently, they got rid of Tiller. But before I talk about why that's good, so Helm, it was like a client-side binary that you would run, and it would then deploy Tiller services into your cluster. So it basically creates a deployment and a service, Kubernetes deployment and services called Tiller. And they made it so that you could install packages. But by default, it's cluster admin, and it's unauthenticated in your cluster. So any pod in your cluster can reach out to Tiller and say, hey, install this package. Which, if you're super security people and you don't have any breaches, that'll be fine, right? But anyone's like, so you could have a low-level developer that has access to a pod, and if he gets into the pod, he can run whatever he wanted to from Tiller, right? And so since it was cluster admin, it could do anything. So we actually there's a link here.
This is a really good blog on exploring the security problem.
We're not going to cover the whole thing. He sort of goes over like how to install it as well. But if you scroll down a little bit, there's this right here. So he deployed a pod that has the Helm binary inside of it, and so he's using Helm in the cluster to try and talk to Tiller. So if you do the typical so I should clarify beforehand. You can't like go through Helm to Tiller nicely using the binary. There's some off there, but since you're in the cluster, you can directly point it to the port straight to Tiller, and then you can talk directly to it without authentication, which is what I was talking about being unauthenticated. So he's pointing it directly to the port that Tiller's running on and is telling it to install this chart. So he has a low privileged container. He tries to get the secrets from the kube system namespace and gets denied. And then he wrote a chart that gives cluster admin to the pod it's running in. So he runs he installs the chart, which gives him the pod that he's in, the privileges it needs. And then he tries again to get the secrets, and you can see them. So if you're inside the cluster with Tiller running as cluster admin, you can do anything. So the great thing about Helm now is they've decided that Tiller's not a great idea, and they've taken that out. So now Helm goes through the API server like everything else.
That's in version 3. I think it's like beta now or something.
Yeah, it's like, yeah. So it moved in the right direction, right? Like there's been a lot of technologies over time that started really non-security-ish that have moved that way. So Helm's moving that way, which is great. And then there's those commands there. That's like all it takes to install Tiller as cluster admin. So it's like super easy. You just Google it, and then all of a sudden anyone can be root in your cluster, right? So
they kind of try to warn you when you do this. You guys have probably seen that warning where it's like this is insecure, or they kind of try to warn you a little bit, but
just hit enter a few more times.
Yeah,
that is fine.
All of the like documents on how they do it, or I feel like I've seen a cloud provider just say like install Helm using this, and they don't ever highlight like, by the way, this is really, really bad practice, right? So it's really easy to just install Tiller and not have any idea. You're basically, if someone pops a pod in your cluster and they find that, it's game over, right? Your entire cluster is now gone.
So his example, he actually like downloaded the chart into the pod, but you can install charts from URLs as well. So you just like give it your GitHub link to the chart that you want to install, and away you go. Like it's way easy.
Okay, so other dragons. So be aware.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So what is the best practice then for Helm goals?
Yeah, so if you can scope it down, you can scope it down to be lower privileges. If you can't do that, you can actually, it's really messy, so I hate to say that, but they had documentation on how to use like client server authentication, and it ends up being more certificates to manage.
A lot more.
It's involved.
Yeah, it's very involved.
Right, it's pretty involved, but at least at that point you're not, or an alternative, here's an alternative, you could turn on network policy and block that, so only whatever needs access to that will be able to get to it, right?
Are you guys using Helm backend, or if you?
We allow Helm to be installed per namespace if the
Right.
tenant wants it, but I don't think it's
But
installed.
the cluster administrators themselves don't use it.
Yeah.
And that's not because of any particular reason, it's just they haven't chosen to do so. I've seen people use Helm in very restricted fashions where they're just using it as kind of like a quick deploy thing and then they can shut it off, but I guess it depends on how you're using it, right? The network policy is probably the easier route, but
Or just don't use Helm.
or don't use
Or
Helm.
don't use Helm.
Yeah. Or wait until version 3, right?
Or just don't use Helm.
Helm is seriously like people love it. I don't know. I'm sure it has some convenience to it,
Yeah,
but
generally I recommend my clients don't use it.
Yeah.
It's just not with the headache that comes with it.
right, that's fair. Other questions? That's a good question. Okay. So other dragons, again, be aware of your network exposure for the metadata service. So this is a tricky one that maybe you think of, maybe you don't. So Google has a really cool talk that they did with Shopify at KubeCon this last December, where they had what they call an SSRF vulnerability. Basically, the application was written in such a way where the attacker could inject like a URL and using the trust of the server, actually tell the server, like, go get the metadata service information. And using its own trust, it's like, okay, well, yeah, I'll just do that, right? And so this application was able to go and grab stuff out of the metadata service. The talk is more involved in this, but basically they were able to get information out of the metadata service that allowed them to, in the end, what would have been an entire cluster compromise. It was a security researcher, got paid like $25,000 bounty, and Shopify cleaned everything up, right? But it was a combination of the metadata service being exposed, using a beta Google API feature, because there was one of the ways that you avoid an SSRF vulnerability is that typically the application doesn't have the ability to control what headers it's sending. So you could, in Google's case, the way to avoid this vulnerability is you require an additional header. It could be like a plain text header. It's not necessarily secret, but it's something that your application is not going to include out of the box. So if you have one of those vulnerabilities, it's not going to include that header, so you're not vulnerable, right? Which they actually had that running, but there was a beta endpoint that didn't require that header, and so therefore the attacker was able to exploit that, right? So basically what it comes down to is if you don't have to use network policy, use something, block access to the metadata service in any of your cloud providers, or in general, there may be other endpoints on your nodes that maybe you don't want access to. Metadata service is just an example, right? Alternatively, I know there are good proxies out there, open source, like I think KubeTIM is a pretty popular one. Basically, just be careful, right? Some of your instances have pretty high privileges.
I don't know if anyone has their own data center, but if you're switching between like data center and cloud, data center, unless you've implemented your own metadata service, doesn't have a metadata service. So you could be like accustomed to that, and then you start deploying into a cloud and completely forget about the metadata service.
Right. So
it's sort of a consideration you have to take.
So the other one is we mentioned the API server. So that this
Don't
was
put that on public, please.
Yeah, generally if you don't have to have it on the internet, please just try not to, right? Like if you have one of the Kubernetes vulnerabilities that came out in 2018, then this will save you a little bit of like, now you're responding to the CTO, like I'm going to patch this within today, instead of like, okay, but it's only whitelisted to us, so we're probably okay. Like we'll make sure that it's done safely, right? So really it can just save your hide. Plus the API server itself is probably the biggest attack surface of Kubernetes, right? Because we're talking about the thing that manages the entire cluster, right? If you can limit who has access to that, yeah, it requires strong authentication, but the minute there's a 0-day release, then you're running at all speeds, right? And maybe there's vulnerability we don't know about, as always. So that's just best practice. Additionally, the kubelet API, this isn't as big of a deal as it used to be. There's a blog post on Medium. I think it's called like analysis of kubelet API or analysis of a Kubernetes cluster hack, something like that. A few years ago, the kubelet API had, I think it was port 10250, exposed the /exec and /run endpoints and didn't require authentication. And so this dude had his cluster open to the internet, and someone just started running Bitcoin miners on his cluster, right? So, I mean, this requires authentication now, thankfully, right? But again, the concept is, why expose this to the internet if you really don't need to? You'll just save yourself some hassle. Dashboard. How many of you guys heard about the Tesla attack? Anybody? So Tesla exposed their dashboard to the internet. The blog on it is kind of vague about details, but somehow the attacker was able to get cryptocurrency mining across the entire cluster. And so I would probably, if I can read between the lines a little bit, that may mean either one, they had a secret exposed in the dashboard that had high privileges, or two, the dashboard was running with high privileges.
Probably that one.
Yeah, I was guessing probably the second one. So generally, it's just not, again, why would you want an attacker to have access to your dashboard, even if they see the front page, right? Prometheus. So Prometheus is used for monitoring and metrics. This is another instance where Prometheus, for example, I think in their documentation they say, don't expose this, like put a proxy in front of it. I think that's their solution, right? So there may not be anything sensitive in here, but there might be, and at the very minimum, you're telling an attacker, this is my network and this is what it looks like, right? These are the applications that are running here. So typically not recommended. We've actually seen instances where some applications will store secrets in Prometheus, not necessarily Adobe applications, but open source applications. So not great, right? And then Spark and Jupyter, these are machine learning applications. Jupyter early on didn't require authentication out of the box, and I think Spark had a component that also didn't. So if you expose it to the internet, again, these services are dedicated to having you run compute, right? So like if I'm an attacker, I want to make some quick cache. Like, sure, give me your Spark cluster. That'd be great. I'll just run my miners right there. And then finally, don't empower the default service account. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So in each namespace in your Kubernetes cluster, there's a default service account, whether you know it's there or not. What happens is that Kubernetes mounts the default service account into every pod unless you give it a specific service account. And so if you empower that service account because you need it for one of your applications, and then down the road, a day later or whatever, you just decide, okay, I'm going to spin up another application, that application will actually have the same privileges as the other application that you now empowered. So instead, what you should do if you need more privileges to the API server in another pod is put privileges, on a specific service account rather than the default. Any questions? I know that was a lot of information.
Well, and also you can turn that off on the cluster too, which is fast.
Entirely?
Yeah, I think you just, like, it's like service account disabled or something like that, right? Okay, so finally, to end, useful resources. The Kubernetes CIS benchmark covers more than we did about like flags that you probably don't want to disable. It's kind of long, honestly.
It's not fun to read, but it probably should.
Yeah, like maybe you want to read it like before you go to bed, and then
yeah, put you to sleep.
Yeah,
read it out loud to your
but honestly,
significant
it's an awesome,
other,
like,
put them to sleep too.
It's just documentation, right? But these guys have done an awesome job. I've been talking to one of the maintainers of the benchmark, and he's fantastic. These guys do a fantastic job, and they just have lists of like, you should never use this flag or this flag or this flag or this flag or this flag. You know, it's like, yeah, I should probably not do that. And then here's the talk that I was talking about, water everywhere, making Kubernetes audit logs potable. And she does a pretty good job of describing.
I have to know,
do that.
kubectl or kubectl?
Or
CTL, this group.
Cuddle, CTL. Good, okay. We
There's
can be
no
proud.
cuddling.
No cuddling.
There's no cuddling in this room. Okay.
She says cuddle quite a few times.
She does.
I mean, in the metadata in the HTML, it's officially.
I saw that.
I saw
Twitter,
that.
somebody mentioned that.
That made me very sad.
Edit wrote it. kubectl.
There you go. All right, so that's
Just alias it to K and there's
there you go.
Lots of people do.
There you go.
Yeah.
I'm going to have a polite disagreement. Just on the CIS benchmarks, be smart about what you implement, I think, across the org. Don't take that as like a golden 12
Right.
commandments.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
That's the fastest way to just make your life hell. I've worked with a couple of clients who have mandated that you follow SIS to the letter, and it has broken so much. So use your best judgment. There's a lot in there that Paul and I were just chatting, academic.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And then honestly, if you're worried about that, you better have all your other security bases covered before that even becomes a concern. So just don't
Yeah, so see,
read it, take what works for your org.
Yeah.
But make sure you have, if you're wasting your time implementing SIS, you probably have bigger fish to fry in your security area.
And
Yeah.
that should apply to like everything we've said as well. If it doesn't work for your org, don't do it, right?
I mean, there are some of those that are standard best practices, but I agree. So CIS, like they have different levels. So some of them are like level 0 or level 1. This is,
Level 2.
yeah, and the further down you go in levels, the more of like, okay, that's a little ridiculous. We'll probably never do that. You get, right? So, and some of that is because I think they support, I don't know if they support government or.
Yes. DoD,
So,
FedRAMP,
right. So some of those, I don't think any of us really love the idea of going DoD level of securing our Kubernetes clusters, right? So yeah, you definitely take it with a grain of salt, but they do a very in-depth view of everything that you could do wrong, right? But I would agree, you can definitely break things
Don't
by.
implement it.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, don't directly throw that bad boy into prod and expect everything to work, right? Yeah. Good, thanks for the clarification.
There are actually some pretty good projects that will actually do a test of your.
Yeah, I've seen a few of
Kubernetes,
those.
right?
Yeah, Kubernetes, and there are a couple others.
There's like Docker Bench and other things too.
And they're quite useful to just kind of get a sense of how bad things are.
And then you don't have to read the docket, right?
How many red lines come out of the
Yeah.
like?
But still, I think it's the same thing as
Right.
usable, secure, kind of in the
Right.
middle.
Well, it depends on your requirements, right? That was kind of when we started. That's why we asked multi-tenant versus single-tenant, because a lot of the things that we do make a lot of sense for multi-tenant. But if you're single-tenant, maybe that's way too much of a pain. It kind of depends on your security requirements, right? If you're a bank, maybe you need more. I don't know.
That's the whole presentation. Does anyone have any questions regarding Kubernetes or what we've talked about? We're not experts in Kubernetes. We're experts kind of in what we've talked about, but
When you talk about some of the policy stuff, have you looked at the open policy agent or any of the stuff around that?
Yeah, that's cool. We actually, we do have open policy agent running in the cluster. We still have, I think we still have a lot we could implement using open policy agent.
does everybody know what the open policy agent is?
So open policy agent, what it does, you probably do a better job than I do.
We're just looking into it as well.
Okay, so what it is so you can write custom admission controllers, right? And what an admission controller does is you submit. You used to have a good picture of this. I don't know that I have it anymore. Here, give me a second.
I think 1.0 yet, or they released something.
It's another team doing it, so I've
I'm not
waited
sure.
for a little bit.
Okay,
I just know
yeah, I
I'm
don't
gonna
have
learn
it. But basically what happens is when you send a request to the API server, the admission controller can take it and either mutate it or validate it. And so you can have a custom admission controller, which when you submit an API request, it calls out to an external service and says, is this good or is this good or bad? And so you have some set of logic that says, according to my policy, yes, this is good, no, this is bad. So what Open Policy Agent does is instead of you writing a ton of code that defines that policy of what you want to do, you take Open Policy Agent, which already has written that code, and you take their policy templating language and you say, this is the thing that I want to look for in this YAML file that someone has submitted to the cluster, and validate it against my policy that I've written in their policy language. If you're interested in that, there's some really good talks again from KubeCon 2018 that I would definitely check into. But yeah, it's extremely flexible. You can do about anything you want with enforcing policy.
Isn't there like a repository or like
I think so.
a gallery of here's things that work and what you might want to look at?
Yeah, I think.
The original intent of that service was to validate CRDs, right?
Was it? Yeah.
It's an
I don't
admission
know.
controller.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there are some examples, but I don't remember where. Definitely a cool project though. Yeah.
On the openpolicyagent.org, they've got a bunch of.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's pretty good. There it is.
Have you done anything with Federation? You mean the
Cluster Federation?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I think that's something they've looked into, but I don't think it's.
I haven't done. I just wondering where that would go with security and how that goes across.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it gets tricky.
Interesting to find that out later on.
Cilium is actually, so they did a talk at KubeCon, but they talked about federating clusters between, like from a Cilium point of view, where you can do really cool things, like let's say that you're running in like Amazon East US1 and then Oregon, and if Oregon goes down, Cilium automatically knows and you load balance all to the other. So they did some really cool stuff there. I think that's separate than the actual federation, but they've done some cool stuff there. Oh yeah, look, there's a good picture of what I tried to describe there. So you submit a request to the API server, mutating admission webhook goes to Open Policy Agent, it responds back, and yeah. So yeah, this piece of code is what we're talking about here.
You know any much about how you cache that? Because that gets a little bit interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure honestly. Yeah. So this isn't also, you can also use this outside of Kubernetes, was the thing that the Open Policy Agent guy made sure that we knew. Like here they're doing do we allow this guy to SSH in and install this package? And based on policy, you can call out to this other thing and say, nope, that's unallowed, and block it. So
I think our security team was looking into it as a way to unify not only policies for Kubernetes, but also policies for general AWS resources.
it's pretty slick. Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Cool. Well, that's all we've got for you guys, unless there's other questions.
Thank you.